So let's say that we're starting with an existing database server on its own machine. And then we also have an administrator workstation and a new server that we've designated as the SalesLogix server, so that can be on its own machine. The first thing we do in Lesson 1 is create an SLX service user, which we can do from any machine on the network by a network administrator. And this user represents the user under which the SalesLogix server service runs. Next, we install the administrative tools on the SalesLogix server. And what's included in this installation? Well, we have the administrator application, which we would also install on the administrative workstation. And then we could also install the application architect and the architect on a separate developer workstation, but it's commonly installed on the server as well. .NET extensions are also installed, as well as administrative utilities, which are run by the administrator, so they would also go on the administrative workstation. The next application that we install in Lesson 3 is the network client, commonly referred to as the LAN client, and we do this for each salesperson. Within the LAN installation, we also have a SpeedSurge client installed. And then, now that we have installed, let's take a look. How does the client talk to the server? Or really, how does any administrative application on another workstation talk to the server, for that matter? Well, port 1706 must be open on the SalesLogix server's firewall. In fact, it would probably be open both ways. Open the port on both the client, which means the administrator or the developer or the salesperson, and the servers. And we can see this through the data link manager. So a data link stores information about how a client will log on to the SalesLogix server. And if you explore the data link, you can see that the port number used is 1706. And then, of course, the SalesLogix server then uses the SalesLogix connection, which stores information about how the SalesLogix server communicates to the database server. So this OLEDB provider may be SQL server or it may be Oracle. Next, in Lesson 4, we install SpeedSurge server, and that allows the SpeedSurge client to search for data in the SalesLogix database in a series of indexes. We can install the SpeedSurge server on the SalesLogix server machine, or we could put it on its own machine if you have the room for it. In our example, we do have another server available, so we'll just take advantage of it and install it on its own. Lesson 5 introduces web components. And first we create a web DLL user, which is what runs the IIS process and application pools. And we want the SalesLogix web server installed on its own dedicated machine. So after we deploy the SLX web portal, a user can then view the SalesLogix website over an HTTP or HTTPS connection. The user doesn't have to necessarily install any software, it just accesses the website through a browser. But there is one optional client download that a web user has available on the logon page, and that's called the Desktop Manager, and that just allows drag and drop functionality and a couple other enhancements with email integration. But again, that client download is an optional component. In Lesson 8, we explore web reporting. So Crystal Report Server is required for web reporting, and both Crystal Report Server and web reporting could go on their own machine or separate machines, but we're going to install them on the web server in class. And then in Lesson 9, we also deploy the customer portal, process host, and lead capture on the same machine as well. Now, so far, all servers connect to the SalesLogix server via port 1706, and this time with the exception of the application architect for deployment. It just uses Windows authentication to do its work to the IIS server, and the person, not the service user, logged onto the machine needs to have access to the administrator IIS on both machines and then write permissions to the IIS directories. Lesson 10 explores synchronization. Now the sync server goes on its own machine for sure. In this scenario, we're going to put it on the same server on which SpeedSurge is installed. Something lightweight like that is no problem, but we wouldn't want to install the sync server on the SalesLogix server. Now sync logs, meaning the sync logs folder, goes on this server, and the SLX service user needs to have access to this location, which is usually the root of C. Once we have the sync server working, then we set up a sync transfer profile so that we can assign it to a remote user in Lesson 11. And at that point, we install the remote client for the salesperson. Now the remote client looks exactly like the LAN client, even has speed search client, but it also has its own database attached so that this person can access SalesLogix data when they're not connected to the network. The database is a subset of the main office database. So the user continues to make changes to his or her local database. But then when the user gets a connection again, either the LAN connection at the office or even internet through FTP or HTTP, that person uses the sync client to then reconcile all of the local changes and push them up to the sync server against the main office database, and then the sync server likewise pushes all the relevant changes back to the remote user through the sync client. Now the disconnected web client works in the same way, but for the web version. So this user also needs a remote database with a sync client for transferring data back and forth to the sync server. But instead of having a client application installed locally, a disconnected web client user gets a personal web server installed with a copy of the SLX web portal so that he can access this version of the web client without having an internet connection. And finally, although we don't include SalesLogix Mobile in this course, this tool is also a web-based application. And then we would just deploy an SLX Mobile portal, which we could view in an HTML5 compatible browser on a mobile device. And this client talks to the database via SData, which we do configure in the class.